Russia is suffering one of the most stunning defeats in history against the legendary defense of the Ukrainian army. The mass surrender of Putin's soldiers is changing the fate of the war. But what is the reason for the surrender of Russian soldiers to Ukrainian soldiers who are believed to be weaker than them despite being outnumbered? The number one reason is, of course, the exemplary defense of the Ukrainian army in many areas. With a historic resistance, the Ukrainian army managed to foil all of Russia's plans. But can the success of an army force its enemies to surrender? This question is very important. Let us go to the battlefield to answer it. Russia currently occupies 3 regions in Ukraine: Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia. Kassel, the largest regional capital occupied by Russia, was liberated by the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army managed to push Russia to the eastern side of the Dnipro River. Of course, this was not easy. The Ukrainian army managed to gain the upper hand in this war by making very important strategic moves. In total, more than 90,000 Russian soldiers have been killed so far. The first reason that pushed the Russian soldiers to surrender was this feeling of great defeat. Russian soldiers are now fully convinced that they cannot win this war against Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has managed to gain the psychological upper hand. So many soldiers have died in the Russian army that all the soldiers who are fighting now think that they will be killed if there was a conflict. That's why they are trying to escape from the army or surrender immediately. On many fronts, Russian soldiers immediately started waving white flags when they saw the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers surrendered by raising their hands without any conflict. The Ukrainian army is constantly sharing these images. Ukrainian drones record all the movements of the Russian army. The surrender images of Russian soldiers are also recorded by Ukrainian drones. When these images are shared on social media accounts, they attract great attention. The biggest interest is shown by other Russian soldiers. Russian soldiers share these images with each other and say that they should surrender. In addition, the Ukrainian army shows a very positive approach towards the surrender to Russian soldiers. Russian soldiers who surrendered to the Ukrainian army say that they were treated very well in the videos they shot and called on other Russian soldiers to surrender. In the most popular of these videos, the Russian soldier said, "Here they give us hot food, winter clothes, and a comfortable bed." None of this is in the Russian army. Zelensky took a very important step in this regard and made a call to Russian soldiers to surrender. It is claimed that thousands of soldiers surrendered after the speech of the Ukrainian leader who addressed Russian soldiers on television. This critical move of Zelensky is considered as one of the events that changed the course of the war. Here is what Zelensky said in this program. "We have been listening to your conversations among yourselves. We know what you think about the senseless war, the shame, and your state on behalf of the Ukrainian people. We offer you a choice. If you surrender to our forces, we will treat you the way people deserve to be treated, the way you are not treated in the army, the way your army does not treat our army. The choice is yours." There are other reasons why Russian soldiers are so eager to surrender. For this, we need to know the structure of the Russian army. The Russian armed forces have 1,014,000 active and 2 million reserve personnel. It is also the second largest power in the world in terms of the number of soldiers. In addition to mercenaries in the Russian army, there are soldiers from many different ethnic elements. The Russian Federation has 22 republics. Minority people living in these regions are also recruited in the army. However, racism is quite high in Russia. Soldiers recruited from minority regions are treated very badly. Russian commanders do not care about the death of minority soldiers. This situation increases tensions in the Russian army. Soldiers who are mistreated by their commanders are much more willing to surrender because these assimilated people do not want to fight for Russia. At this point, it is necessary to open a very important topic in Russia. It is not believed that this war contributes to the interests of the country. The majority of Russian citizens do not support this war. Anti-war protests are increasing day by day. This is Putin's war, not ours, say the Russian rebels. This slogan is also affecting the soldiers in the Russian army. Russian soldiers do not want to die for Putin because the number of those who think that this war is being fought only for Putin's political career is quite high. The other big problem in the Russian army is mercenaries. The Russian army cooperates with the Wagner Group for the organization of mercenaries. This mercenary company run by Prigozhin is identified with many war crimes. It is claimed that the Biden government will recognize the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization due to the pressure of Prigozhin, the president of Wagner, on the Russian government. Mercenaries have many privileges. There is a great tension between mercenaries and Russian citizens who are compulsory service. Being in the military, this situation completely disrupts the hierarchical structure in the Russian army. In fact, the hierarchical structure in the Russian army has long been breaking down. Ukrainian troops have killed many generals in Russia. Also, generals who did not want to be part of this war resigned to replace these generals. Many Ukrainian soldiers were promoted. Therefore, the Russian army was led by very inexperienced commanders. This situation led to constant chaos in the Russian army. Due to this chaos, many wrong decisions were made in the Russian army and a serious vacuum of authority was created. This led to the surrender of more Russian soldiers. The surrender of Russian soldiers has another great advantage for Ukraine. Russia is forced to take back its surrendered soldiers. That's why they need a prisoner exchange. If the Russian army captures Ukrainian soldiers, the Ukrainian government saves its soldiers by making a prisoner exchange. Thus, the surrendered Russian soldiers ensure the liberation of Ukrainian soldiers. Thanks to the great superiority of the Ukrainian army in this war, Russian soldiers continue to surrender day by day. The Russian army does not have enough soldiers left to fight Ukraine. Critical health corridors, right, came from Ukraine. The Russian army was at a loss what to do in Donetsk. The ingenious operation of Ukrainian soldiers in this region drove Putin crazy. Then Putin's threats against the countries supporting Ukraine stunned everyone. But the US response to these threats resonated all over the world. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, one bombshell after another came. The Russian army has accomplished a huge disgrace in the Ukrainian region. This outstanding success of the Ukrainian soldiers will completely change the course of the war. This operation, which is the result of the support the Ukrainian army has received recently, was very important. It became clear that Russia had decided to pursue a different strategy in the regions where it attempted to invade. This strategy was to deal a solid blow to the Ukrainian army. Russians with high combat experience against Ukrainian soldiers, especially if they were pro-Putin, were quickly promoted in rank and became headquarters commanders. One of these Russian soldiers incurred the wrath of the Ukrainian army. Russia was literally cornered to beat this. Thanks to its developing intelligence, Ukraine has started to identify all Russian headquarters in this region. The equipment used to identify these headquarters has been provided to Ukraine with aid since the beginning of the war. But thanks to this latest training, every step Russia takes and all its headquarters in the region can now be detected thanks to this detection. Ukrainian soldiers have carried out one major operation after another against the Russian army. But thanks to this last operation, Putin was dealt a very heavy blow. The Ukrainian army first started to collect intelligence specifically for the headquarters where they planned to organize an operation. This operation to be organized in Donetsk, which has been in the hands of Russia for a while, was very critical in terms of regional dominance. Russia's doubts that we had already occupied Donetsk made the operation even easier. When the Ukrainian army contacted its agents inside the Russian army, it learned that there were not enough security measures. And most of these headquarters, the most important reason for this was Russia's complacency in the occupied territories. This was one of the major problems that the Russian army faced from the very beginning of the war. Ukraine has managed to turn this problem in its favor. Every time in this operation, the Ukrainian army also decided to deploy critical weapons. The Russian army, which had attacked Bakhmut intensively, had directed all the means at its disposal to this region. But thanks to this surprise attack by Ukraine, the Russian army suffered a very heavy defeat. The details of the operation shocked the whole world. The Ukrainian army first started to determine the equipment it would use in the attack on this region. At this point, one of the internal intelligence was that there was no air defense system protecting this headquarters in Donetsk. This led the Ukrainian army to bring out the Bayraktars, which it has been actively using since the beginning of the war. In addition to the Bayraktars, the Ukrainian army also mobilized HIMARS. This once again showed everyone how big an operation the Ukrainian troops were going to organize. The Ukrainian army, first of all, deployed Ukrainian special forces in this operation. When the Ukrainian special forces arrived in this area, the Russian soldiers were cornered. Knowing how critical the operation was, this group mobilized the Ukrainian army, which blockaded the corridors during the watch. Change of the observation units first called for surrender. The Ukrainian army was vastly outnumbered. The Russians were surprised by the call to surrender, but immediately afterwards, not knowing the number of the Ukrainian army, they went for their weapons. Russian soldiers who could not understand where to deploy in the clash suffered heavy damage. But when the persistently refused to surrender, HIMARS came into play. First, HIMARS missiles began to fall one after another on the Russian military headquarters. After that, Russian soldiers panicked and tried to communicate with the Kremlin. But the Ukrainian army had activated jammers in that area. Unable to call for support, some of the Russian soldiers began to flee. This caused panic among many soldiers on the front line. In successive attacks, Ukrainian soldiers neutralized the headquarters commander. The Ukrainian army then took advantage of the panic and once again called for surrender. The Russian army decided to surrender with the loss of the commander's life. This operation was recorded as the biggest operation of the Ukrainian army in Donetsk. The Ukrainian army has recently begun to deliver one serious blow after another. Thanks to these blows, Ukrainian soldiers have cornered Russia badly. It is not yet known what Russia will do, especially because of the rank-and-file soldiers who have lost their lives recently. If the situation continues like this, there will be no commander left to lead the Russian army. Russia will again pay the price for Putin's rapid expenditure of troops. Putin is one of the biggest reasons why Russia is in such a failed period in terms of war. The reason for this issue, which the whole world is wondering about, is again related to Putin's evil plan. The fact that the Russian army was so firmly cornered stunned the whole world. It has once again been revealed how bad the Russian army, which is known as the second most powerful army in the world, is in a bad state. During the Soviet Union, Russia was even considered the most powerful army in the world. But everything changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the Putin regime. For a long time, Putin has been having great difficulties in governing the country, thinking that the army might stage a coup because of these problems. Putin has started to take constant measures against this. One of these measures was to dismiss successful generals in the army who could be associated with coups. These were generals who could have been very successful against the Ukrainian army. But Putin forcibly retired each and every one of them. Finally, it was Sergei Surovikin's turn. Sergei Surovikin was a former commander of the Ukrainian front, but because Putin had discarded anyone who might have been a rival, he chose to put Russia in a bad situation rather than succeed in Ukraine. Surovikin's most important characteristic was that he had serious battlefield experience. But what really scared Putin was Surovikin's intense relations with Prigozhin. If Prigozhin, whom he saw as an alternative to himself, came to power, Putin would be in a very difficult situation in response to this difficulty. Putin's fall from power was the beginning of a very big crisis because Putin had been in power for nearly 30 years. During this period, he had committed many crimes and war crimes for which he could be tried. And not only him, Putin's entire circle of bureaucrats would be considered responsible for these crimes and would be severely punished by international courts. Aware of this, Putin gained the power to cancel even the elections if he had the slightest doubt. He even decided to build a very strong army in case of popular uprisings and troubles. This army was in charge of protecting Putin's regime. This army, consisting of approximately 340,000 people, caused a lot of controversy. The fact that Putin, who continues on his way with an anti-democratic administration, took such a measure was actually an indication that he was afraid of falling from power in the near future. In response, for analysts, comments justified Putin's concerns. According to war analysts, Putin was about to face a very big problem. Russia is in its most difficult period for a long time. This period has put Russia into a huge crisis, especially in economic terms. If Putin's steps continue in this way, events will start to come to a much harsher point. And with this, Putin's power will come to an end this time.